On Christmas night I stood completely still as the cake struck my face. Laughter broke out around the table, light and careless, and no one stepped in to stop her. What they didn't understand in that moment was this. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a choice. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Evelyn. I'm 68 years old and I live near Madison, Wisconsin, where winters stretch long and quiet, and neighbors still nod politely when they pass. For most of my life I believed that if I stayed kind and consistent, the world would eventually meet me with the same grace. I believed patience could soften even the sharpest edges. I believed family, especially complicated family, deserved loyalty even when it was difficult. That belief shaped me. It also kept me quiet far longer than it should have. I never imagined myself becoming a stepmother. That chapter arrived later in life, after loss, after a first marriage that didn't end with shouting, but with signatures and silence. When I married Frank, I knew I wasn't just marrying a man. I was stepping into a history that already existed. His daughter Lauren was grown, guarded, and convinced from the start that I was an outsider intruding on a story meant only for her and her father. I told myself that was normal. I told myself time would do what effort alone could not. So I tried quietly and consistently to earn my place without asking for it. I cooked the meals everyone expected on holidays. I remembered birthdays that weren't mine to remember. I hosted Christmas dinners year after year, making sure Lauren's favorite dishes were always on the table, even when she barely looked my way. I paid attention to details others overlooked, who preferred strong coffee, who needed gluten-free options, who felt more comfortable in quiet corners than crowded rooms. I believed that care given long enough would turn into respect. Frank depended on me more than he ever admitted. He liked to say we were a team, but when moments came that required him to stand beside me, he often stepped back. He avoided conflict the way some people avoid storms, by pretending they'll pass if you don't acknowledge them. When Lauren made comments about how things were different before I came along, or how traditions now felt forced, Frank would clear his throat or find an excuse to leave the room. His silence wasn't neutral. It trained her. It taught her exactly what she could get away with. By the time Christmas arrived that year, the atmosphere in the house felt tight, like a held breath. I noticed it in the way Lauren arrived late and scanned the room as if she were assessing a situation. I felt it in Frank's distracted nods, the way his eyes drifted to his phone instead of meeting mine. I told myself it was just holiday stress. I told myself not to overthink it. I had become very skilled at doing that. The table was full that night. Relatives, neighbors, familiar faces who had watched me play the role of gracious wife for years. Laughter echoed off the walls, but to me it felt hollow, like sound without warmth. When dessert was brought out, I stood to help because that was what I always did. That was when Lauren reached for the cake. I remember noticing how steady her hands were, how deliberate the movement felt. She didn't look to me. He didn't hesitate. She glanced at her father just once. Frank said nothing. And then the cake was on my face. Cold frosting tangled in my hair, crumbs clinging to my sweater, sugar and humiliation pressed into my skin. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Then someone laughed. Someone else looked down at their plate. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood there and breathed. And inside me something settled, not anger but clarity. In that instant, I understood that everything I had endured had been seen, stored and weighed. I understood that quiet does not mean powerless. Sometimes quiet means prepared. I wiped my face, excused myself and walked to the bathroom alone. In the mirror I saw a woman everyone thought they understood. What they didn't know was that Christmas night marked the end of that version of me. The last night I would accept their definition of who I was. After that night I chose to sleep in the guest room, not because anyone suggested it but because I needed air. I needed distance. Once the house emptied and the noise faded, everything felt different. The room seemed smaller. The silence felt heavier, pressing against my chest in a way I couldn't ignore. I lay there watching the ceiling fan turn slowly above me, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about who I had become in that family, and how quietly I had let myself fade into the background. As I've said, my name is Evelyn. I'm 68 years old and I was raised in a time when women were taught that being steady was a virtue. We were expected to hold families together without complaint, to smooth over tension, to endure rather than confront. That lesson followed me into adulthood and into my second marriage. By the time I met Frank, I had already learned how to survive loss without becoming bitter. I wore that as strength. I believed it made me resilient. Frank and I found each other later in life, both carrying histories we didn't talk about much. He was charming in a quiet, contained way, polite, dependable on the surface. He spoke often about wanting peace, about being exhausted by conflict. I mistook that for emotional maturity. It took me years to understand that his version of peace often meant avoidance. When we married, I promised myself I would never compete with his past or with his daughter. I told myself there was space for all of us if I was patient enough. Lauren never shared that belief. From the beginning, she treated me like a visitor who had stayed too long. She avoided using my name whenever she could, referring to me instead as my dad's wife, even years into my marriage. When I reached out, inviting her to lunch, asking about her work, remembering small details she mentioned, she met me with polite distance or irritation she didn't bother to hide. I told myself not to take it personally. I told myself she needed time. I said those words so often they became a shield. Before the betrayal, I was emotionally tired but still hopeful. I believed that if I stayed calm, if I never raised my voice, things would eventually settle into place. I believed Frank would step forward when it truly mattered. I believed Lauren's sharpness was temporary, not intentional. Those beliefs shaped every choice I made. I swallowed comments that stung. I excused behavior that crossed lines. I became the woman who kept everything running so smoothly that no one had to notice the cracks beneath the surface. What I didn't admit to myself then was how isolating that role had become. Being the responsible one often meant being invisible. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I was afraid of losing the fragile balance I had spent years maintaining. I told myself that at my age, stability mattered more than pride. I convinced myself that absorbing small humiliations was simply the cost of keeping the family together. But lying alone in that guest room, replaying the sound of laughter after the cake hit my face, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just hurt. I was awake. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What had my silence really cost me? And who, exactly, had benefited from it? I didn't have the answers yet. But I knew this much with certainty. The woman they humiliated at that table was not weak. She was finished pretending that patience meant accepting disrespect. In the days after Christmas, life slipped back into its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Frank returned to his routines as if nothing had cracked. Lauren stopped by once, acting casual, almost cheerful, as though humiliation were just another awkward holiday moment best forgotten. No one apologized. No one acknowledged what they had done. That silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. I moved through the house with calm steps, but inside I was taking careful inventory. I noticed how Frank avoided the subject entirely, how he suddenly found small tasks to occupy himself whenever I entered a room. I saw the way Lauren spoke a little louder than necessary, her confidence intact, her posture relaxed, as if she were certain there would be no consequences. Their ease rested on a single assumption: that I would continue to absorb whatever they gave me, quietly and without resistance. Before all of this, my days followed a dependable pattern. I woke early, made breakfast, and handled the details that kept the household steady. I paid bills, organized paperwork, scheduled appointments. Frank trusted me with those responsibilities because I was reliable. He liked that I didn't challenge him, that I didn't question decisions once they were made. What he never considered was that reliability creates familiarity. And familiarity creates knowledge. And knowledge, given enough time, becomes power. The warning signs had been there long before Christmas. Frank spoke about the house as if it belonged solely to him, even though my name was on every important document. Lauren referred to it as her family home, never our home. Plans were made without my input, especially when they assumed I would agree anyway. On the rare occasions I didn't, my concerns were brushed aside gently, the way one dismisses a child's worries, with patience that masked disrespect. Emotionally, I stayed composed, but I was shrinking. I learned to choose my words carefully, to express disappointment without sounding upset. I told myself that calmness was a form of control. But the truth was harder to face. I had been managing their comfort at the expense of my own dignity. Christmas hadn't created the problem. It had simply revealed what had been quietly growing for years. I began to understand that what hurt most wasn't the cake itself. It was the certainty in Lauren's eyes when she did it. The certainty that nothing would follow. That certainty hadn't come from nowhere. It came from her father's silence. Frank had taught her without ever saying a word that I was expendable. That realization didn't ignite anger right away. It sharpened my focus. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped offering emotional labor where it wasn't valued. Said I observed. I replayed conversations in my mind. I remembered promises, signatures, agreements. I had always been careful. Now I was deliberate. By the end of that week, I knew exactly where I stood in that family. And for the first time, I also knew exactly where they stood with me. Before the conflict, my life was built on routine and responsibility. I woke before the sun every morning, not because anyone expected it but because I valued the quiet. I made my coffee slowly, planned meals for the week, and checked the calendar for anything that needed attention. Holidays were never last minute for me. I organized them months in advance, making careful lists so nothing and no one would be forgotten. I believed that preparation was a form of love, that staying ahead of things was how you showed care. Frank relied on that more than he ever acknowledged. He liked to describe himself as easygoing, but in truth he avoided details whenever he could. I handled the practical matters, insurance paperwork, utility bills, maintenance schedules, without complaint. When something went wrong, I fixed it quietly and moved on. That reliability earned me trust, but it didn't earn me respect. Over time, I faded into the background like a piece of furniture everyone depended on but rarely noticed. Lauren's behavior fit perfectly into that dynamic. She treated me less like a person and more like a convenience, someone whose purpose was to make things easier for her. She corrected me in front of others over small, unnecessary details. She made jokes that cut just enough to sting, then smiled as if daring me to respond. When I remained calm, she took it as permission to push further. Frank never stepped in. He told himself it wasn't serious enough to address, and that silence gave her confidence. The warning signs were never dramatic. They were subtle and constant. Lauren changed plans without telling me, assuming I would adjust. Frank promised to talk to her, then conveniently forgot. When I tried to express discomfort, I was told I was being too sensitive. Over time, I began to notice how easily my feelings were dismissed, how often my discomfort was treated as an inconvenience. So I kept going. I told myself that at my age, peace mattered more than pride. I believed family stability was worth a little personal discomfort. I convinced myself that if I stayed patient long enough, things would eventually settle into place. But patience without boundaries isn't peace, it's permission. And I had been giving far too much of it. Christmas was meant to be a moment of togetherness. I spent weeks preparing, making sure every detail felt right. I wanted the day to feel warm and familiar, a reminder of what family was supposed to be. Instead, it drew a sharp line between who I had been and who I could no longer afford to be. After that night, the routines that once comforted me felt empty. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt revealing. I began to see my role clearly, not as a partner or a parent figure but as a convenience. And once I saw that truth, I knew something had to change. The betrayal didn't feel sudden when it happened. It felt inevitable, like something that had been moving toward me quietly for years and finally reached me when everyone was watching. Christmas dinner was supposed to be the warmest moment of the day. The table was full, candles glowing, voices overlapping in polite conversation. I remember standing near the counter, watching everyone take their seats, already tired in a way that sleep never seems to fix. Lauren had been restless all evening. She paced the room, checked her phone, laughed a little too loudly at things that weren't funny. Frank noticed, of that I'm sure, but he didn't ask what was wrong. He never did. When dessert was brought out, I stepped forward to help because that had always been my role. I had chosen it again and again, even when it quietly cost me. Lauren reached the cake before I did. I remember the weight of the moment right before it happened, the brief pause, the way she looked at her father. It wasn't a look asking for permission. It was a look of confirmation. Frank met her eyes for a second and then looked away. That was all she needed. The cake hit my face hard enough to sting. Cold frosting slid down my cheeks, crumbs clung to my hair and collar, sugar and humiliation pressed into my skin. For a heartbeat, the room went completely still. Then someone laughed, soft at first, uncertain, and then louder. A few people froze. A few stared at their plates. Frank stayed exactly where he was, his hands at his sides, saying nothing. I stood there with my heart pounding and my ears ringing. I felt exposed and small and yet strangely calm at the same time. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I understood in that instant that anything I said would be twisted, dismissed, or used against me. So I chose silence. Lauren stepped back, smiling as if she'd just won something. She said it was a joke. No one challenged her. Frank finally cleared his throat and suggested we clean up. And just like that, it was over. The humiliation was wrapped up and pushed aside, treated like a minor spill that could be wiped away. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I locked the door and faced my reflection. My face was flushed, my hair disheveled, my eyes steady. I cleaned myself slowly and carefully. I wasn't shaking from fear. I was shaking from understanding. That hadn't been an accident. It had been a test. And everyone in that room had chosen a side. When I came back out, dinner continued without me. No one followed. No one apologized. That's when it became clear that the betrayal wasn't only Lauren's act. It was Frank's silence. It was the quiet agreement to treat my dignity as something optional. In that moment, something inside me closed. Not my heart, but my willingness to endure. That night, after everyone had gone and the house finally settled into silence, I stood alone in the bathroom far longer than I needed to. I washed my face twice, not because it was still dirty but because I needed time. I needed something steady to hold on to. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked composed on the outside and fractured underneath. I gripped the edge of the sink and focused on my breathing, reminding myself that I was still here. Still upright. Still standing. When I finally went to bed, Frank was already asleep or pretending to be. I didn't wake him. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't ask for an apology. I already knew what he would say. He would minimize it. He would tell me Lauren didn't mean it. He would ask me not to make a big deal out of it. I had heard those words in one form or another for years. I knew how that conversation would end before it ever began. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the scene over and over. The look on Lauren's face, the burst of laughter, the silence that followed. I felt embarrassed not only by what had happened, but by how long I had allowed myself to be treated as less. I wondered how many times I had told myself to be patient when what I really meant was to endure. How many moments I had explained away so I wouldn't have to confront the truth. The days that followed felt heavy, as if the air itself had weight. I moved through the house like a guest, careful and quiet. Frank spoke to me politely, cautiously, as though he were afraid I might finally say something out loud. Lauren acted normal, confident, unbothered, untouched by guilt. No one mentioned the cake. No one checked on me. No one acknowledged what had happened. That absence of accountability hurt more than the act itself ever could. I felt isolated in a way I hadn't felt before. At my age, people assume you're settled, that you've figured life out, that you're past the point of feeling uncertain or trapped. They don't expect you to feel cornered by your own choices. But I did. Trapped by expectations. Trapped by the idea that starting over was unrealistic. Trapped by the belief that enduring was safer than confronting what needed to be faced. Inside, I argued with myself constantly. One part of me wanted to speak up, to demand respect, to finally draw a clear line. Another part warned me to be careful, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace I had worked so hard to maintain. That internal struggle was exhausting. It forced me to see how much energy I had spent protecting everyone else from discomfort while carrying my own quietly year after year. What frightened me most wasn't the possibility of losing the marriage. It was the thought of losing myself. I saw how easy it would be to let that moment define the rest of my life. To grow smaller, to accept humiliation as the price of belonging. That realization scared me more than being alone ever could. In that heavy silence, something finally became clear. I wasn't powerless. I had simply been choosing not to use my strength. And once I understood that truth, the feeling of being trapped began slowly to loosen its grip. What they never truly understood about me was that I had always planned for stability. Long before Christmas, long before that cake ever left Lauren's hands, I had made careful decisions about my future. I didn't talk about them. I didn't announce them. I simply did what needed to be done, quietly and responsibly, the way I always had. Years earlier, when Frank and I married, I insisted on clarity. Not because I distrusted him, but because I trusted experience. I had already lived through one marriage ending, and I understood the cost of assumptions left unspoken. The house we lived in wasn't something I stepped into blindly. My name was on the paperwork for a reason. The savings accounts weren't managed casually or carelessly. I kept records because that was who I was. Organized, prepared, steady. Frank used to joke that I worried too much. He said I thought 10 steps ahead when one would do. I smiled and let him believe that. What he never realized was that while he avoided details, I mastered them. I knew exactly what was in my name and why. I knew which accounts were joint and which were not. I knew what protections I had put in place years before Lauren ever decided I was disposable. After Christmas, I began reviewing everything with new eyes. Not emotionally, practically. I pulled out files I hadn't opened in some time. I read documents slowly and carefully. I reminded myself of conversations Frank had long forgotten, of agreements we made when things were calm, when respect still existed, when my caution had been welcomed rather than dismissed. There was no anger in that process. Only clarity. I saw how much of the family's comfort rested on my quiet, consistent work. Bills paid on time. The house maintained without worry. Financial decisions handled smoothly without stress or discussion. I had made life easy for them. And in doing so, I had slowly made myself invisible. That realization brought another truth with it. Respect doesn't grow from sacrifice alone. It grows from boundaries. And somewhere along the way, in my effort to keep the peace, I had allowed mine to fade. This wasn't about revenge fueled by anger or bitterness. It was about restoring balance. About making sure the woman who stood still on Christmas night wasn't mistaken for someone who had nothing left to stand on. I didn't confront anyone yet. I didn't change my behavior on the surface. I let them believe that things were settling back into normal. But inside I was planning, not to harm them but to protect myself. For the first time in a very long while, I felt grounded instead of small. They thought my silence meant I had accepted my place. In reality, it meant I was preparing to change it. The morning after I finished reviewing those documents, I made a decision that felt calm and final. I didn't wake up angry. I didn't wake up afraid. I woke up clear. For the first time since Christmas, my chest felt steady instead of tight, as if something heavy had finally been set down. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and I knew I didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not yet. I waited until Frank left the house before I picked up the phone. Not because I was hiding, but because I wanted privacy. I wanted to speak freely without being interrupted or gently talked out of my own reality. I called a local attorney whose name I had kept for years, just in case life ever demanded it. When her assistant answered, my voice didn't shake. I asked for a consultation and gave my name. Saying it out loud felt different this time. Firmer, steadier, like I was finally standing in my own truth. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad laid out in front of me. I wrote down dates, details, moments that had felt insignificant at the time but now formed a clear and undeniable pattern. I wasn't building a case out of bitterness or spite. I was documenting my life. For the first time, I treated my experiences as something that mattered enough to be recorded. When Frank came home, I greeted him the way I always had, calm, polite, familiar. I didn't mention the phone call. I didn't bring up Christmas. I watched him as he spoke as if nothing had changed. That alone told me everything I needed to know. He believed the situation was over. He believed my silence meant acceptance. In the days that followed, I began making small, deliberate changes. I stopped covering for him when bills were due. I stopped smoothing over tension when Lauren visited. I listened more than I spoke. Each silence became intentional, not habitual. With every quiet decision, I felt myself stepping back into my own life, inch by inch. The turning point wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no argument. No raised voices. It came in the quiet realization that I was no longer afraid of what would happen if I stood my ground. I had spent years holding the family together at my own expense. Now my focus had shifted. I was no longer protecting the image of harmony. I was protecting myself. I understood then that justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives softly. Sometimes it begins with a single phone call. Sometimes it starts the moment a woman stops apologizing for taking up space. I had let the cake hit my face on Christmas. But from that moment on, nothing else would land without my consent. That decision changed everything, even if no one else could see it yet. The confrontation didn't unfold the way people imagine these moments do. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic exit meant to make a point. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, weeks after Christmas, when the house was full again. Frank had invited family over, trying to recreate a sense of normalcy, as if enough time had passed to soften what had happened. Lauren was there too, confident, relaxed, moving through the room as though she owned it. I waited until everyone was seated. Not because I needed an audience for revenge, but because I needed witnesses for the truth. When I stood up, my hands were steady. My voice didn't rise. I didn't accuse or lash out. I spoke the way someone does when they are finished negotiating with themselves. I said I needed a few minutes. The room went quiet, surprised by the shift in tone. Frank's discomfort was immediate. I saw it in the way his shoulders tightened. Lauren smirked, clearly expecting an emotional outburst she could dismiss later. In that moment, I understood just how wrong she was. I explained calmly that Christmas had changed something fundamental for me. I didn't describe the cake in detail. I didn't replay the humiliation. I focused on what mattered, that the silence afterward had shown me exactly where I stood. I said I had spent years carrying responsibilities that went unnoticed, and that I was finished doing so quietly. Then I spoke about facts. About paperwork. About finances. About the house. I didn't hold anything up or dramatize it. I didn't need to. Frank's posture shifted the instant he realized I wasn't speaking in abstractions. Lauren stopped smiling when she understood this wasn't a conversation she could laugh away. I made it clear that I had already taken steps to protect myself. That boundaries were now in place. That access they had always assumed would be there was no longer automatic. I wasn't asking for permission. I was informing them of a change that had already happened. Frank tried to interrupt me, suggesting we talk privately. I told him this was the conversation he had avoided for years, and it was happening now. Lauren accused me of overreacting. I reminded her, quietly and without emotion, that humiliation isn't a joke when it's one-sided. The room stayed silent. No one rushed to defend them. No one laughed this time. The shift in power was unmistakable and everyone felt it. I ended by saying one simple truth, that I would no longer remain in spaces where my dignity was optional. When I sat back down, my heart was racing but my mind was clear. For the first time, they were the ones unsure of what came next. And I knew without any doubt that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, the way truth often does, quietly settling into every corner of the house they once believed they still controlled. After that Sunday, nothing felt casual anymore. Conversations became careful. Movements were measured. Frank moved through the rooms like someone who had misplaced something important and didn't know where to begin looking for it. Within days, the practical changes began to show. I adjusted access to accounts I had always managed quietly without ceremony. Bills were no longer paid automatically from shared funds without discussion. I didn't announce these decisions. I didn't justify them. I simply made them. When Frank noticed and asked questions, I answered calmly with facts instead of emotion. That steadiness unsettled him more than anger ever could. Lauren reacted in a different way. She lashed out first, accusing me of turning people against her. She said I was rewriting history, that I was being dramatic over a joke. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I told her evenly that jokes don't require permission to stop, and consequences don't require agreement. The certainty in my voice caught her off guard. She had never heard me speak like that before. Word began to spread through the family, not because I whispered or complained, but because behavior changes speak for themselves. People noticed that invitations now came through me. They noticed decisions were no longer made over my head. They noticed Frank no longer spoke confidently about plans involving the house. The narrative shifted quietly, the way it always does when the truth is finally given room to breathe. Frank tried to regain his footing by appealing to our history. He reminded me of the years we had shared, of compromises we had made together. I listened without interruption, but I didn't bend. I told him that history can explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. In that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. My patience had never been endless. It had always been conditional. Socially, the laughter stopped. The people who had looked away on Christmas now avoided my eyes. Not because I demanded accountability, but because they felt it. Silence carries weight when it's supported by action. The shift in power wasn't loud or cruel. It was firm, unmistakable. And once it settled in, there was no pretending it hadn't happened. Victory didn't arrive with applause or celebration. It arrived as peace. It showed up the first morning I woke up and realized I wasn't bracing myself for the mood of the house. It was there when I made decisions without rehearsing explanations in my head, without preparing for resistance. It came quietly without spectacle, but it was complete. I didn't rush to leave and I didn't demand dramatic changes. I chose independence the same way I had planned everything else in my life, carefully and with intention. I set boundaries that were clear and non-negotiable. I decided where I spent my time, who had access to me, and what behavior I would no longer tolerate. For the first time in years, my days felt like they belonged to me again. Frank struggled most with this new reality. He offered apologies that skimmed the surface, hoping things could return to the way they had been. I listened calmly and told him that apologies only matter when behavior changes. I wasn't angry anymore. I was finished waiting. Whether he chose to reflect or remain the same was no longer my responsibility. Lauren stopped coming around as often. When she did, she was quieter, more cautious. The confidence she once carried so easily had thinned. It had been built on the assumption that I would always step aside, always make room. Once that assumption collapsed, so did her certainty. I didn't take pleasure in her discomfort. What I felt was clarity, and that was enough. Emotionally and financially, I was secure. I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from. I took long walks in the mornings, letting my thoughts settle instead of pushing them aside. I invested time in things that reminded me who I was before I learned to make myself smaller for the comfort of others. The house felt different now, not because people were missing but because respect had finally entered the space. And if it ever tried to leave again, I knew exactly how to show it the door. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't begged. I hadn't retaliated in the way they expected. I had simply stopped accepting less than I deserved. And that, I learned, was far more powerful than any confrontation. When I look back on that Christmas now, I don't remember the cake as clearly as I remember the moment that followed. The moment I chose not to break. I once believed strength meant reacting, defending myself, proving my worth. I understand it differently now. Strength is knowing when to remain still and when to move with purpose. I learned that age doesn't make a woman weaker. It makes her clearer. By the time you reach your 60s, you've already survived losses no one applauded, disappointments no one noticed, and long stretches of silence that taught you endurance. The mistake is believing that endurance equals permission. It doesn't. Endurance is survival. Permission is something you choose to give, or take back. I also learned that family can wound you more deeply than strangers, because they know exactly where to strike. But those wounds don't have to dictate the rest of your life. They can become turning points, if you allow yourself to stop explaining your pain and start choosing your peace. What happened to me on Christmas wasn't only humiliation. It was a lesson in truth. It revealed who was willing to stand beside me and who benefited from my silence. It taught me that dignity isn't something you wait to be granted. It's something you guard. I didn't win by shaming anyone in return. I won by reclaiming my life. I won by refusing to make myself smaller so others could remain comfortable. I won by remembering that my value existed long before anyone tried to strip it away. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you from my story, let it be this. Quiet women are often the strongest in the room. And when they finally decide to stand, everything around them begins to change. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If this resonated with you even a little, know that you're not alone. Strength doesn't always look loud and justice doesn't always come with noise, but it does come when we choose ourselves. If you found meaning here, stay with me, there are more stories to tell. And before you go, take a moment to remind yourself, your dignity is worth protecting at any age.